The gap between rich and poor is getting wider. Most of the world's wealth generated last year ended up in the pockets of already very rich people, while billions are struggling simply to survive. Why can't the world be more equal? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hashem Ahelbarra. The rich are getting richer and the poor poorer. Oxfam's latest report on inequality paints a stark picture of a widening gap between the world's haves and the have-nots. 82% of global wealth generated last year went to the richest 1% of the population. For the 3.7 billion people who make up the poorest half of the world, there was no increase in wealth. Oxfam pins much of the blame on the erosion of workers' rights and big business having too much influence over government policymaking. In an attempt to balance the scales, the charity is calling for a minimum wage people can live on, higher taxes on the rich, and more spending on public services like health and education. According to Oxfam's data, 42 billionaires control as much wealth as the poorest half of the world's population. As of early January, Amazon boss Jeff Bezos is the world's richest man with a fortune topping $100 billion. Only 1 out of 10 of the world's billionaires are women. L'Oreal heiress Lillian Bettencourt was worth nearly $40 billion when she died last year. And most billionaires are from Asia, with China leading the pack. Its booming economy can produce 2 new billionaires every week. Let's bring in our panel. Joining us from London, Vicky Pryce, an economist at the Center for Economics and Business Research. From Rabat, Haddad, a Moroccan MP and professor at Mohammed V University. Also in London, Philip Legrand, an economist and author of European Spring, Why Our Economies and Politics Are in a Mess and How to Put Them Right. Welcome to you all. Let me start by asking Ms. Pryce this. Why has income inequality worsened over the last decade or so?
Well, the truth is that income inequality, if you're looking at across the world, has not worsened, in the sense that many people have come out of the poverty line. Hundreds of millions of people in China, for example, but also India, are now earning considerably more than they did before. But what has been happening while this growth has been going on in a number of countries that are now sort of developing in a very reasonable way, what's been going on is that, in fact, the distribution of wealth has not held up in any sensible way. So what we found is that, looking at the data, but Oxfam has done that particularly well in their report, it is that a lot of the wealth has been concentrated in too few hands in the developing world. It's been going on, of course, in the developed for some time, but the developing world is suffering significantly from the fact that the money has not been distributed fairly across, and people often earn very low wages, which are hardly able to support them.
Mr. Haddad, is it because of the way business is conducted in the modern time? Is it because of globalization? Is there any particular reason why we're having this gap?
Well, I think that there is this gap because there is a sense, like a lot of leeway that has been given to a lot of rich people, in this sense that there are tax breaks, there are also a lot of incentives when the capital moves from the global north to the global south. There is also a lot of, there is the theory actually that has been going on for for so many decades now, that what is good for the rich is also good for the poor, in the sense that the more wealth you create on the upper level, then a lot of it will go, or some of it will go down to the others in terms of job creation, in terms of business opportunities. But what is happening is, like, there is some sort of growth in the wealth worldwide, and some of the poor are less poor in some of the countries. But the problem is, like, the share between those who are rich and those who are poor is widening, in the sense that there are more people up on the upper level making more money than those who are actually like on the of the poorest kind of levels. So I think there is, yes, it's globalization. It's also theories that exist within governments about how to do business and what is the best way of actually achieving economic development.
Mr. Legrand, there is a tangle here between the wealth inequality and income inequality. If you look at the global wealth generated, 67% is in Europe and the United States of America, 2% in Africa. So is there any element of instability, war, conflicts that is very conducive to this situation, or do you think more is something intrinsic to the capitalistic system on its own?
I think, first of all, it's important to point out that, yes, there are very big disparities in global wealth and in global income, and it's important that we try to reduce them. At the same time, it's misleading to suggest that only a few billionaires are benefiting from the global economic system and the poorest half of the population are not. The share of the world population living in extreme poverty has fallen from 35% in 1990 to 10%. You look at real wages in China over the past decade, they've trebled. And the garment workers who Oxfam point to in their report in Vietnam and in Bangladesh are actually doing much better, typically, than most people in those economies. So I think it's quite wrong to suggest that somehow it's only benefiting the very wealthiest. At the same time, there clearly is a big problem. And I think partly it's due to globalization, in the sense that before those who were successful at a local level. Now they can be successful at a global level. The market is much bigger, and therefore the rewards of the most successful are larger. Second of all, the explosion of the financial sector and all the wealth that has been taken by the participants, though not necessarily the investors in the financial sector. And then thirdly, you've seen, I think, increased monopoly power of some companies and them using that monopoly power to reward their CEOs in an excessive way.
Ms. Pryce, I mean, even before Oxfam issued the report, this is something that has galvanized attention for quite some time. If you remember, a French economist, Thomas Piketty, said in his book that as long as the returning capital is bigger than the growth, you will continue to have the same problem, basically, which is a tiny minority ending up with loads of cash and billions of people suffering.
Well, I'm afraid that's probably the case, but I think it's worth looking at what is going on in a number of economies. The reality is that a lot of the money has not been used for public spending more generally to improve infrastructure, health, education for people, particularly for women in a number of areas. The Oxfam report highlights that. So it's not just the case of perhaps wealth being concentrated in a few hands because of capitalism and so on, the way that it's been developed, that Thomas Piketty has spoken about. It is also that policies within individual countries have just not done the right thing. And that's where the focus needs to be. Of course, we need to do something about having greater access to the money and everyone, in fact, paying a fair tax. But you need a real restructuring of the way in which government is run, and also the way in which companies that operate in those countries themselves are treating their own workers. Corporate social responsibility was something everyone was talking about until recently. It seems to be slightly forgotten. But some of the recommendations in the Oxfam report are that there should be a huge amount of spending done by the public sector, that one should watch what happens and what you subcontract to the private sector, things that we also see, of course, in the developed world being an issue. But more generally, it does require an awful lot of money to be directed the right way. So technical support, but also frowning upon the way in which some of the leaders of various countries operate, more controls of what happens to the money that should be legitimately staying in the country. A lot overcorruption is there. That is not something
we're talking about,
that an organization like Oxfam can necessarily solve overnight.
Talking about
there has to be international cooperation, basically, and new rules.
I see. Mr. Haddad, now, on the other hand, you have conservative economists saying that the only way out of this inequality is basically tax cuts and government deregulation instead of imposing taxes on the wealth.
I don't think so. I think there needs to be some sort of business environment where people can invest, so some sorts of tax incentives are good. But I think reducing really like the corporate tax and also the income tax so much, and then not having, for example, taxes on capital gains or on dividends is not the way to go. And as the Oxfam kind of report showed, if there is only 1.5% taxes on the billionaires, that will probably like deal with the education problem that exists in developing countries. So I think that there needs to be like a fair system of taxation in the sense that it's not a lot of pressure on the business, but at the same time, I mean, I think we need to generate a lot of income and resources. You know, when there are, for example, like pressures from international organizations, a lot of the African countries, but also South Asian countries and Latin American countries, in order to balance the budgets, also to have like some sort of macroeconomic soundness. What really like gets kind of sacrificed are the spending on education and spending on health and all of that. And I think those kinds of you cannot have that. You cannot have like reduction in terms of spending and at the same time, I mean, have reductions in taxes. I think that's something that is probably like mathematically impossible. Therefore, I think some sort of tax system which does not give tax breaks for the rich. And a lot of the rich, although they may get like tax breaks, I mean, some of that money is not reinvested in the economy, as the conservative theorists like say about
Mr. Legrand, how can we juggle the need to implement those reforms and at the same time take into account a new changing dynamic in the world? Technology, for example, has been taking away jobs from the middle class. How can you address this situation when the world is moving fast towards a new territory?
You're absolutely right to say that technology has been taking away some jobs. It's also been creating new ones. The road to success is to try and accelerate the benefits that we get from technology while ensuring that those benefits are widely shared and while equipping workers with the skills to acquire the new jobs that are being created and indeed to continue changing jobs over time. I think looking at the poorest half, who are the focus of the world's population, who are the focus of the Oxfam report, I think there's lots that can be done at a national level in terms of raising minimum wages and ensuring that labour regulations are properly enforced. There's lots that can be done in terms of ensuring that taxes are raised more efficiently, that they actually are progressive. Very often in developing countries, they hit the poor hardest and the rich not at all. That they focus on wealth and not just on incomes, and in particular on wealth that can't move. So, for example, property, which is easier to tax than more flighty forms of wealth. And that there be a government that genuinely works to improve the living conditions of everyone, not a government that is captured by cronies of the ruling class and cosseted businesses. So, you know, the model is a development of a country such as South Korea, which invested very quickly in education for all, in infrastructure, and ensuring a competition among firms, not oligopolies that exploit the population.
Ms. Pryce, I mean, the moment you talk about how to move forward, then you have two options. People would tell you countries that provide more equal distribution of income, like Scandinavia, for example, could be a role model. At the same time, you get the same reaction from people in the US telling you that's class warfare. We should not allow for any system similar to that one to prevail. I mean, how can we balance the two approaches? One which is in favor for a more private sector to be aggressive, and one which says, no, we need to have the public and the private sector come together to solve this issue?
I think the public sector and the private sector have to work together. There is no doubt about that. But if you compare countries which have quite a lot of equality, where the state sector works, is quite large and works quite well, perhaps with the private sector, and you look at others where this isn't the case, and you have a more unequal society, there isn't any direct link that tells you that one grows less fast than the other. Certainly if you look at the short to medium term. But if you keep those inequalities going for a long period of time, what you get is huge disruption and dissatisfaction in the country. And therefore you get fewer people wanting to invest and lower growth. So there are long-term negative impacts of having that inequality remain. And what is more, you then get people moving out of the country, perhaps particularly those who can afford to go elsewhere, and you rob the talent from the countries, you leave them behind with less productivity and less growth. But also then you accentuate the problem for the rest because of huge migration flows that we're seeing right now. So I'm afraid what needs to happen is a sort of two-pronged thing. First of all, to see whether there is some money that can be transferred, either by taxing perhaps some of the very wealthy, but also the Western countries paying more into the developing world than they've done so far. So it's not just relief and support for famines and so on, but actual proper economic development money going in, but working very closely with the government. So that would be the first way of doing it. And the other thing is to possibly think of the types of sanctions that can be used against countries that don't follow that principle, because in reality, if they can carry on trading just as they did before, despite the fact the population is suffering actually in relation to just a few people at the center or at the top, then you don't actually get anywhere. So there has to be a system that is working across in terms of trade, rules for taxation, whether we accept any goods for people or even oil from countries which actually don't do the right thing. So it is something that does, as I said earlier, require quite a lot of working across, but with international organizations which are very important, like the IMF, the World Bank, which are there as well, and working quite closely with some of the leaders.
Speaking of the system that works through Mr. Haddad, in Morocco, a country that faces financial constraints, basically there's been always this debate about the need to impose higher minimum wage, greater access to education to shrink the wealth gap. Is this something that is feasible?
Let me just speak to the question of international development. I think what is happening right now, if you look at the international development scene, there are about like $14 billion that is spent by rich countries on poor countries. But at the same time, with a lot of the investments and globalization and a lot of the big kind of businesses in the global south, they reap out something like $6 trillion in terms of tax breaks, in terms of profits, in terms also of cheap labor and all of that. So it's a very unequal kind of situation in terms of international development. I mean, I think it can work, but I mean, not really like that well. So I think what needs to happen is to have like a fair kind of system, financial system, which now like profits more. I mean, like the global north, it's very advantageous to a lot of the businesses, but also to a lot of the wealthy people in the global. But I mean, like talking about what needs to be done, I think one of the things that needs to be done is actually conditional cash transfers to the poor. That's something that needs to be done. It needs to be conditional, but it needs also to be accompanied by some sort of skill training for a lot of the poor. And I think it has worked in a lot of countries. The other thing is like a lot of people have moved from poverty and then they are now in the middle class, but they are very vulnerable because they are close to poverty. They can fall back any kind of time. So strengthening those through education, through incentives, through different kinds of support so that they can stay in the middle class but also have the right skills in order to function is something that needs to be done. But I mean, like for a lot of countries, including Morocco, but also in the global south generally, what needs to happen is to move away from the clientelist kind of system where there are revolving doors between the businesses and the political elite. That's one of the problems. A lot of the business people are also part of the political elite. A lot of the politicians become businessmen, and there are all kinds of like pass-throughs that happens in that kind. And I think there needs to be an oversight and also very, very good system of transparency and accountability.
Speaking of the oversight on this particular angle, Mr. Haddad, and this is going to be my question to Mr. Legrand. I mean, we're talking about the need to reform the financial system on its own, but at the same time, people are saying that what needs to be done, first of all, is to ensure that the 1% elite that accumulates wealth stops using the political establishment to further advance its own economic agenda. How can you implement it?
Yes, well, I mean, I think financial reform has to be right at the top of the global agenda. You know, it's amazing. We've had the worst financial crisis since the 1930s, and there's been a bit of tinkering around the edges, but basically the system is intact. And now with the election of President Trump, there's talk of the United States going backwards on some of the regulations that have been put into place. And I think that's a very big difference between the global businesses which are being attacked often in this Oxfam report, which perhaps could behave better, but at the same time are creating products that people genuinely want and employing people doing valuable things, and a financial sector which sometimes does productive things like helping to finance companies, but on the other hand often engages in destabilizing speculation, blows up bubbles, causes crises, and enriches the participants in that system, not necessarily the investors. And then when things go wrong, use their links to governments to get bailed out. And I think that's the deep cause of the political troubles that we're seeing in Europe and in North America. The sense of injustice is completely understandable and right, and very, very little has been done of it. And I think if there has to be a focus for reform, really cutting the financial sector down to size, ensuring it serves the needs of the real economy rather than its own, and ensuring that when things go wrong, the people in the financial sector bear the losses rather than being inflicted on society as a whole, has to be an absolutely top priority.
Mr. Pryce, I mean, in this particular part of the world, we're talking about an area beset by wars, conflicts, instability, massive destruction. You talk about the need for hundreds of billions of dollars in the near future to be able to address the situation. Is this something which is the instability that is marring the region, that it worsens the situation, it adds to this gap that we're talking about?
I'm afraid so. So conflicts don't help at all. And of course, they create quite a lot of uncertainty. But of course, we've seen the humanitarian costs that are there. Rebuilding it afterwards takes a long time, and it has already done terrible things to the fabric of society. So getting back to something more sensible takes time. So any way that one can avoid those conflicts to begin with, and it's easier said than done, of course, but also being absolutely prepared to help with the reconstruction afterwards is also significant, to allow, therefore, the cooperation between businesses and government to come back so that there is some certainty when companies invest. And I understand exactly what we've just been talking about, which is the financial sector sometimes not being very helpful, but we do need the funding. There is just no doubt about it, that somehow or other one requires big transfers of funds, maybe Marshall funds.
Marshall Plan there.
Like we had after the Marshall Plan of sorts. So the size of the Marshall Plan funds, which we needed in Europe, we actually need an awful lot in various places in the developing world, particularly in areas of conflict. And this migration that I mentioned earlier needs to be tackled that way too. But I think just one short point about corruption. I think that is something quite significant when Oxfam talks about taxing the money and making sure it gets redistributed. We often don't actually know where that money is,
Mr.
where it's
Haddad,
gone
please,
and whose it is.
I'm afraid I'll just have to get one last question to Mr. Haddad, in less than a minute, please. When you see the leader of the United States of America saying that there's absolutely no way we can give money to the rest of the world unless they are on board with us, are you concerned that the idea of cooperation, the richer helping the poorer, might come to an end?
Well, I think it's also like a question of leadership, and I think a country like the United States should go on leading in terms of international development, but also in supporting all the kinds of UN agencies, but other actors on the ground that are doing like fabulous work in terms of poverty reduction. So I think it's in the interests of the United States, but also it's the interests of the leadership. But I mean, should that happen, I think there are other kinds of players that will come in. I mean, like China is ready to move in as a leader. I mean, it has the money, it has also the power to do that. Well, can I just go back
very
for
briefly,
1 minute
please.
to the
Yes,
question of the Middle East? Very briefly, the inequality and the injustice is also one of the factors that led to the revolutions, whether it's in so many of those kinds of countries.
Thank you.
So the inequality, it leads to revolution. Most of the revolutions actually don't create equality.
Fortunately, we're running out of time. Haddad, Vicky Pryce and Philip Legrand, thank you very much indeed for your time, your contribution to the program. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem, Ahelbarra, and the whole team here. Bye for now.